The intent there would not be to achieve any kind of military success, but to generate a bit of a political crisis in the West that then hands Russia various kinds of advantages, including the collapse of Western support for Ukraine. Putin is in a difficult moment now, and he may well have to escalate. Now, one mode of escalation is to do a mobilization after the election to the Russian parliament. The regime needs to show itself and the country that the country is with it. So it's a special kind of monarchist ritual. The election isn't real, but it's incredibly ritualistically important because it's the source of Putin's perceived legitimacy. Putin thinks of his war with Ukraine as a proxy war in which he's essentially facing all of the West. It's not a war that has escalated as far as it could have done, but it is a war against the West in his mind. Moreover, Putin has some very special views, and some of the people around him have some very special views about the UK. So the UK is a bee in the bonnet for that regime. Now, we shouldn't take this too far and automatically think that this is going to translate into practical action against the UK, but nevertheless, what they think is wrong with the West is maximally exemplified by the UK in the view of people in that regime. And so two things come together, a kind of somewhat mythical ideological picture about the evil West as exemplified by these bad people from this island that we are on. And then there is the practical picture, the continued support for Ukraine of the West, the fact that Western weaponry is being used, the fact that UK-made drones are being used, the fact that there's this indirect involvement. There is a constant attempt to bring it about that support from the West for Ukraine stops. The idea is that it'll just eventually stop by itself, that it'll just sort of collapse when there is increased political crisis, both in the West and in Ukraine. That's the Russian theory of victory over us, that there's a political collapse in Ukraine and that democracy, in the sense of counter-majoritarian institutions, power, checking power to keep everybody free, that goes away in the United States, in the UK, in Germany and France. And then Putin will have the possibility to engage in all kinds of activities, not just in Ukraine, but in Eastern Europe, without the West getting inappropriately involved in a part of the world it doesn't really belong to. So there's all of that practical story, but over and above that, I do think there are special ways in which they are triggered by us. The threats that the Putin regime has made against the UK are, when it comes to the overt versions of these threats, are bogus. In other words, we can't discount them, but they're essentially extraordinarily low probability events. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of direct attack on the UK is always there as an option, in the sense that history is just resplendently weird, but at the level of our anxiety, we should be very, very low on that. What we're really talking about is the escalation of Russia's hybrid war against the West. Putin is in a difficult moment now, and he may well have to escalate. Now, one mode of escalation is to do a mobilization after the election to the Russian parliament in September. Another is to, but this is not likely to happen soon, engage in some kind of low threshold challenge of Article 5, possibly in the Baltics. And then another branch of escalation is just the dramatization of hybrid war against the West. So we might see an explosion here, a bomb going off there, and the Russians are going to say, we don't know anything about that. There could be cyber attacks. But we're talking about an escalation of hybrid war rather than the UK actually being attacked by Russia. One thing that's worth saying at the moment is that there is this timing that really matters between now and the next few weeks. That's to say, they are quite keen to not engage in too much escalatory language until the election is over, and that includes escalatory action too, because it's a very important relegitimation ritual for the regime. The regime needs to show itself and the country that the country is with it. So it's a special kind of monarchist ritual. The election isn't real, but it's incredibly ritualistically important because it's the source of Putin's perceived legitimacy. And so until that takes place and is over, they're going to want to keep it relatively quiet. They're interested in keeping it relatively quiet. And then after, especially the worse the war goes, we are going to see more hybrid action against us. The question is where and what and how. But I don't think it's much of a question whether there'll be more of it. I think it is coming. In my view, Putin is not preparing for a war with NATO, but Putin has several folders available to him. One of these folders is simply to escalate the hybrid war on the West. And another folder is probably something like a low threshold challenge to Article 5, where the idea would not be to get into a war with NATO, but to avoid getting into a war with NATO, to engage in a provocation and then generate political impact out of the anticipated non-reaction by NATO. So the idea is that if Putin does something in the Baltics, lobs a couple of missiles over or makes a very marginal incursion, and essentially not much happens, and not much support comes from the United States, and not much support comes from West European countries. Now, we can be more confident about the reaction of the other Baltic states, about the reaction of some of the Scandinavian countries. But if there is a spectacularly poor Western reaction to a provocation like that, Putin will think he can get great political benefits from it. So the idea is not to conquer as much of Estonia as possible. The idea is to engage in some kind of very low threshold possible provocation of Article 5 there, and then have the political consequence that NATO is emaciated, that it can't do anything, that it is split, that West European countries don't really think of all the East European countries as being proper Europe. They're not really desperately interested in the security of these countries on the edges of Russia. So the intent there would not be to achieve any kind of military success, but to generate a bit of a political crisis in the West that then hands Russia various kinds of advantages, including the collapse of Western support for Ukraine. And so that's why a lot of the perfectly well-argued expert reports which say, well, no, there's a real limit to how much Russia could achieve there militarily. The reason these reports are often impeccably well-argued but not entirely sufficient or conclusive is that they miss the point that Putin doesn't need a military success of any kind, and Putin doesn't need primarily military advantages from an action in the Baltics. The very idea there is to sort of stimulate into a bit of acceleration his story that Western democracies are essentially collapsing, and so are Western security alliances, and they just need to be prodded for that collapse to be accelerated. I think that there are three things that would make ordinary Russians rise up against the regime. One is a crack in the regime. Two is the presence of a leader who not only critiques the regime, but actually offers a proposal for an alternative future for the country that's more substantive than what's offered by the Russian liberal opposition, who talk about Russia becoming a normal Western democratic country. Well, we're sitting in a Western democratic country, and we don't know what a normal Western democratic country is. So it's somebody who needs to make very concrete proposals about the shape of the Russian military, the shape of the security state. What are they going to do with the FSB? Real proposals that currently will speak to people who have power and tell them, look, you're working within systems that are absolutely dreadful. You need change yourself, right? You want change too. And then the third thing would be some kind of spark of bottom-up mobilization. Which is never something you can control, but it can actually be coalesced by a crack in the regime and the presence of an actual politicizing leadership figure. So this needs to be somebody more than just Mr. Prigozhin, who created a nearly revolutionary situation in 2023 by offering a purely negative critique of the regime. Mr. Prigozhin's critique was, you can't do anything you try your hand at. You're useless. And that didn't go far enough because there was no proposal for an alternative that people could rally behind. So if there's a crack in the regime, if there is a leadership figure, and if there's a bit of a spark of bottom-up mobilization, then there's going to be action. One way to sum this up at a psychological level is that Russian citizens are not going to move until they are persuaded that there is an actionable alternative, right? Because human beings do not take risks unless they think they can change the situation. And when humans are convinced that they can't change the situation, they actually begin to deny it more the worse it gets. So this is also one of the paradoxes when you have a very depoliticized population. People enter deeper denial the worse things get, rather than being politicized by the deterioration. But once there is this realization that there is an actionable alternative, then we will see people act and we will see people taking risk. The idea that a lot of people can gather in Red Square and the regime will go away is unrealistic. It's just not going to happen. The regime will be able to take care of any scale of protest effectively, actually, by bringing it about that nobody is motivated to do it. The regime has engaged in a systematic program of campaigns of propaganda and practical action to bring it about that people are convinced that all collective political action is futile and that all collective communication about politics is also futile. So the idea that there is going to be a bottom-up generated revolutionary situation without a crack in the regime and without a leadership figure appearing is, again, not impossible in the sense that there are no laws of history, but this is really sort of winning the lottery sort of statistical odds of that. I think it's not how we should think about it. The worst case scenario for the Russian space is the collapse of the Russian state. The risk of the collapse of the Russian state, if you go back, let's say, 20 years, would have seemed relatively low. You could have anticipated some peeling at the edges. At the moment, I think that the risk of a significant disintegration of the Russian state is real. We don't know what that is. It might be too extreme to say there's a 50% shot of it, but as we're uncertain, it wouldn't be unreasonable for us to plan in that way, anticipating what might happen over the next quarter or half century. That's the worst case scenario, and the model for how that would go is something like the Russian Civil War from the early 20th century. So we would see a lot of bloodshed, we would see unbelievable refugee flows, we would see extraordinarily great geopolitical turbulence resonating across the region, even across the globe. So is that possible? Yeah, that's possible. That's probably the worst scenario for what might happen on the Russian space. In terms of whether a post-Putin Russia would be better or worse if Putin just evaporated tomorrow, and let's say better or worse for us in the West, the answer is, of course, we don't know, but probably better. Why do I say that? If we look at the Security Council meeting Putin had a few days before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, and you count people sort of head by head, and I know quite a lot about a lot of these people, I can't think of a single one who would have started a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. Not even the hawk of hawks, as Mark Galeotti calls him, Mr. Patrushev. So a lot of these people would have started a war against Ukraine. But I don't think anyone there would have started a full-scale invasion of the kind Putin generated. So there are plenty of people more extreme than Putin in the Russian informational space. But if you actually look at people who hold power in that regime, nobody is more radical than Putin. And so if Putin disappeared tomorrow, there's no guarantee it'll be better. But if we had to take this gamble, my recommendation would be let's give it a whirl. Let's go for it. If we could sort of migrate Putin to Mars tomorrow, I think it would be worth doing as much as it would be an uncertain situation.